Finally, I want to thank you for allowing me to move this motion. I can see that we are running out of time, but I'll do my best. I know that in the standing orders, a motion mover requires 20 solid minutes, but I will do what I can with the time that I have. I want to first of all relay just some statistics that are damning so that people can understand what we are talking about, because there seems to be a lack of understanding on this period poverty. 65% of women and girls cannot afford sanitary pads or menstrual hygiene products. That's 65%. 50% of girls between the ages of 15 and 19 years old are actually illiterate, and therefore this lack of sanitary towels or access to sanitary towels further affects their education because they are not able to stay in school throughout. You have about 1 in 4 girls. 1 in 4 girls are married off as child brides as a way of mitigating the issue of period poverty. So for those who actually claim that they have so many daughters, I want them to imagine, members of this house, that 1 out of their 4 daughters is married off because of this period poverty. 10% of the girls are starting menstruation as early as 11 years old. That means previously, we used to have menstruation starting at a later date, but now we have 10% of our girls starting menstruation at 11 years old. And finally, the damning statistics that's there is that 54% of the 10% of the girls who start their menstruation early actually do not make it academically, because due to the period poverty, they stay out of school and they miss a lot of days in school. Mr. Speaker, about a week ago, when I had my incident here, and I was actually asked to leave the house, I want to state that this is not an issue that is only affecting women in the Senate. We have girls who stain themselves actually in school, and because of that, they're asked to go home and change. So they end up missing a whole day from the academic work because maybe someone is embarrassed on their behalf. So the 2 things that I want to highlight while I move this motion, Mr. Speaker, is that 1, there is something called period shaming. It is the culture that we've inculcated, the culture that we have with many senators, even in the House, thinking that menstruation is something that should not be talked about, is something that should be kept private, is something that we should actually not seek pride and celebrate for having been given the powers to bring forth life. But menstruation is apparently something that is shameful, something that is, I heard in this house, a disgrace, something that is disrespectful. And it is because of that, that the period shaming, the culture of period shaming in this country has actually been pushed. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that period poverty actually occurs because of the poverty levels. We have issues around the current provision that is the Amendment Act in the Education Act. I have heard certain individuals saying that there's nothing new we are trying to legislate. But Mr. Speaker, I want to challenge legislators, I want to challenge lawyers to go and read the Amendment Act that was actually slid into the Education Act. And I want to ask them 3 questions. What is the frequency of the provision of these sanitary towels? Number 1. What is the minimum budget allocations of these sanitary towels? Number 2. Number 3, who stipulates which schools actually get prioritized more than the other in terms of that piece of legislation? And number 3, when it comes to procurement, Mr. Speaker, I want to challenge the legislators and the lawyers out there. Can somebody tell me, as much as we are following the Procurement Act of 2015 on getting these free sanitary towels, is it really pushing the local manufacturing industry? We have local manufacturers of sanitary towels who have closed.
Senator Aroba, I believe your time is up. All right, fine. Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I believe I have 20 minutes as a motion mover, so this has been my worry actually. Yes. So I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that the stigma and the period shaming that we're having is because of one thing: the lack of access to sanitary towels. And we want to deal with two things when we are legislating. When I'm moving this motion and we are going to debate, the two things that I want us to delve into is the period shaming and the period poverty. Both go hand in hand. Mr. Speaker, for purposes of the men in this house and for purposes of probably the male gender that is following and they are not aware of what I'm talking about, women have periods. We actually menstruate every other month. We bleed. It comes out of our body for 3 to 4 or up to 7 days, Mr. Speaker. That is a fact. It is a biological fact, and it is not propaganda. While we are bleeding, which it lasts for 5 to 7 days, Mr. Speaker, we need to find ways to be able to carry on with our duties, to stand in Senate and speak. If it's the girls, to be able to continue with the classes. And that's what we are calling the menstrual hygiene products. Those are the things we are calling sanitary pads. Those are the things we are calling tampons, menstrual cups, and all other menstrual products. Mr. Speaker, we need up to 6 pads, sometimes per day, sanitary towels. I want to break it down. 6 sanitary towels. It means that from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to bed, which we still wear the sanitary towels, we need this so that we can be able to continue with our duties. Mr. Speaker, that means that on average, you need 30 pads on average for a person who's bleeding heavily. 30 pads every month. I want to make a comparison so that you understand that the shadow pandemic that we are dealing with is actually a serious issue. 1 pack of 7 pads costs up to 90 Kenya shillings. And if you may need 2 packs or 3 packs, on average, you're using 360 shillings per period, Mr. Speaker. So when we are saying lack of access to sanitary towels, it doesn't mean that the sanitary towels are not there. They are there. But girls and women cannot afford these products. So what do they do, Mr. Speaker? In some areas of this country, Mr. Speaker, we have girls going out under a tree, digging a hole, and sitting on the hole time of their menstruation. I want you to imagine that. I want my fellow senators in the House to imagine that today they are missing the session because they are sitting in a hole somewhere in Samburu. They are sitting in a hole somewhere in Kisii County. They are sitting on a hole somewhere because they have to bleed out on a natural process. That is the reality that is there. Mr. Speaker, when you go to prisons, we have some of the prisoners actually sharing sanitary towels. The visual image of that is that when I am not on my heavy days, I use a sanitary towel, I feel as though I might not be bleeding too much, I pass it over to a fellow prisoner because she's on her heavy days. These are the visual images that I want people to imagine, for lack of a better word. So, Mr. Speaker, when I walk into the house with an accidental stain, and that in itself is such a gory, it's so difficult for my fellow senators to be able to put up with, to the extent that they demand that I have to leave the house. I want them to imagine their constituencies. I want them to imagine their electorate, their bosses who gave them the votes, sitting on a hole the whole day because they cannot afford these sanitary towels. I also want them to imagine their daughters. I had Senator Boni Halwale in the past saying he has so many daughters, he has so many wives, and so therefore he understands the issues of women. I would like for Senator Boni Halwale to imagine all his daughters and all his wives digging holes every single month, sitting on them so that they can be able to bleed in peace because they cannot afford these sanitary towels. Or I want them to imagine, for instance, that the lastborn who does not have a heavy flow can use a sanitary towel, pass it over to one of the wives because the wife has a heavy flow, and use the same sanitary, because that is the reality that we have as Kenyans. This is a real issue. It's a shadow pandemic that we seriously need to look into, and that is why I am moving this motion so that we can be able for once to discuss candidly and openly and debate on matters that directly affect those who have elected us to this house, so that we can come up or support the bill that I'm bringing to the house with an understanding that this is a real shadow pandemic. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of access to menstrual products, I am pushing, and it is actually my prayer through the bill that I'm proposing, that we have sanitary pads, free sanitary pads, given to all public schools, both primary school and secondary school. Mr. Speaker, that is not the reality that we have right now. Yes, there could be one line in our law that states it should be done, but it is not the reality. So we need to find ways to make it a reality. That is the first thing that I'm pushing. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of menstrual stigma and the misinformation, when I came to the House, I had fellow senators telling me it is not possible. There is no way you can have an accident. For sure, you know when you're having your periods. There was a lot of misinformation around that. Just because you do not see the accidents that we women have when it comes to menstruation does not mean that they don't exist, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of misinformation that is actually guiding the period shaming. There's a lot of misinformation that is actually even guiding the policies in this country. And the problem that we have had, Mr. Speaker, is that those who are drafting the policies and the laws actually do not understand what it means to bleed continuously without dying for 7 days and having to manage that. And Mr. Speaker, so therefore, in my submissions, I want us to consider that period shaming is a real thing. We had a girl who actually committed suicide because she stained her dress, and the teacher made some comments that actually, you know, devastated her, made her feel so ashamed that she took her own life, Mr. Speaker. So you can imagine the kind of ridicule that I had when I came to the floor of the House. The kind of ridicule that I had when someone stood and said that, Mr. Speaker, this House is a house of dignity, and so therefore I am not befitting at that moment to be in this House because I am on my period. Mr. Speaker, these are the kind of things that our girls are actually going through down in the grassroots. The only difference, Mr. Speaker, is that they probably don't have the platform that I do have to speak out against certain things. The only difference, Mr. Speaker, is perhaps being a Kisii, from Kisii County, and having been brought up by a single father, I probably have developed a thick skin. But Mr. Speaker, it should not be the case. It should not be the case that our girls are being shamed for actually going through a natural process. So the issue on period shaming is a matter that should be taken into account when putting together this policy. There should be repercussions to teachers, to people of authority who actually castigate girls for going through their period, who make funny comments. That is something that we can legislate. If we are able to legislate sexual harassment, sincerely speaking, we can legislate period shaming. Mr. Speaker, I know that I'm running out of time, but I want to tell my fellow senators, those who probably do not support this motion or do not support this bill, I want to tell them, it is a fact, Mr. Speaker. Of all the women senators that are in this House, they all bleed. All of them. They have their periods every month, some even more than 7 days, some heavier than I do, some lighter than I do. They all bleed. It is nothing to be ashamed of. And the first thing is to talk about it, Mr. Speaker, accept it, because we as legislators, if we are the ones castigating people for having periods, Mr. Speaker, then we are never going to deal with the issue of period shaming, and we are never going to deal with the issue of period poverty. They go hand in hand. If I cannot access sanitary towels, I am forced to use other material. That other material is actually probably going to cause a leak. The leak is going to cause the shame. The shame is going to cause all sorts of other things, including trading my body for sex work so that I can buy those sanitary towels. In the end, Mr. Speaker, we are dealing with teenage pregnancies because of lack of sanitary towels. We are dealing in the end with issues of HIV prevalence within our teenage girls, Mr. Speaker. In the end, we are actually also dealing with a multitude of effects, a domino effect on our society, including early marriages, Mr. Speaker. So the first point is that we must deal with the period shaming, we must deal with the period poverty, and I urge this House, when my bill comes on provision of free sanitary towels, I urge the House, whether they are so uncomfortable with the idea that all women bleed, kindly, I want you to picture your wife, your daughter, your sister being unable to manage their periods because they cannot receive the sanitary towels, and then imagine that you have to deal with it. We are here to legislate, Mr. Speaker, and legislation begins by the understanding of what we are dealing with. Let me complete by saying, Mr. Speaker, Periods are normal. Anyone who wants to shame me for bleeding is completely out of order. And I urge this house to adapt that it should never be in the history of this house again for any woman to be kicked out of the house because of actually having stained their dress because of a period accident, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much for this time. And to my fellow senators, tafadhali, kindly support the bill that is coming to the House. Thank you. I would call
Senator Roba.
Yeah.
Honorable Senators, it's already 6:30. The secondment to this motion will be done in our next sitting. Honorable Senators, it's now 6:30 p.m. Time to adjourn the House. The Senate therefore stands adjourned until tomorrow, Wednesday, 1st of March 2023 at 2:30 p.m.